Well, welcome to the Tocqueville Center's second installment of our March event on America and the global economy. We had a lively discussion last night, inspired by Joseph Brommel's wide-ranging and thoughtful look at the evolving political and economic relations between the great powers. My name is Brent Nelson, and I am the director of the Tocqueville Center for the Study of Democracy and Society, and a member of the Department of Politics and International Affairs. Before we get on with this afternoon's discussion, I would first ask you to please fill out this survey. This is an on Discourse event, so if y'all could take out your phone, click the QR code. It's only a four questions, really quick survey, but it helps us a great deal to know if we're getting anything done with these things. We're trying to open up dialogue among people who don't necessarily agree with one another. Okay, so thank you. While you're doing that, you can listen to this. I want to draw students' attention to a couple of opportunities to get involved in the Tocqueville Center. If you are a student who likes to explore big questions ranging from global politics to the health of the American family, then you might want to join either the Tocqueville Fellows or the Beaumont Fellows. The Tocqueville Fellows, The Tocqueville Fellows are dedicated to this project and wish to go deeper. They make a significant weekly commitment of time and energy to explore the big questions. Applications for next year's fellows are now open. Please use the QR code on the screen to find the application or contact me at the close of our event, and I can put the QR code back up. Those applications are due near the end of the month, the 29th, and so it's getting close. And it is a significant application because it's a competitive group. So if you're interested, please take a look at that and start working on it. If you want to be involved in discussions about the topics explored by our guest speakers, but are unable to make a significant commitment to Tocqueville, the Beaumont Fellows are for you. There's no application. All you have to do is get your name on our list, and you will begin to get information on Beaumont activities, and that QR code would be for you. You can also, where's Maddie? You can also see Maddie over here. She can get you signed up. I can get you signed up. So lots of ways of getting involved in Beaumont, and especially if you want to get on it for next year. If you are somewhat older than a 18 to 20-year-old Furman student, and there are a few of you out there, Ollie has a Tocqueville special interest group. And Mary Jo is right there, and Al is over here. Just wave your arm, and if you're in that category and you want to get involved, please see one of them, and they'll sign you up. So, now to our event this afternoon. This afternoon's topic is globalization. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard the word, but might not be able to define it. There are probably as many definitions of the term as scholars who are studying it, but for simplicity's sake, let me offer my own definition as a starting point. Now, lots of you would argue with me about this, but I'll just let this get out there as a starting point so we know kind of what we're talking about. Globalization is the process of creating a single global economic, political, and cultural system by connecting more people more deeply through the movement and exchange of people, goods, services, capital, and ideas across national borders. So it's the shrinking of our world, the interconnecting of our world, with all the tensions that emerge from that. To help us explore the present manifestation of globalization from different perspectives, we have invited three superb thought leaders to speak to us. Joseph Brommel, whom we heard from last night, and Mark DiPlacido and Scott Lincicome, who are showcased this afternoon. So let me introduce our guests, and then I'll explain what we're doing. And I would like you to come on up here, and I'm just going to introduce two of you now, and Joseph. Well, I'm going to introduce you, Joseph, but you don't have to come up yet because you're not speaking yet. Yeah, soon. Okay. Mark DiPlacido graduated from Yale University. He is now a policy, well, yes, at the moment, he is a policy advisor at American Compass, a leader in the new conservative movement. Before that, he worked on Governor Ron DeSantis' campaign for president. He has also worked as the Deputy Assistant Trade Representative for Public Affairs at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative under Ambassador Robert Lighthizer. He's also worked at Heritage Action, and in the U.S. Senate, he worked with Senator Ben Sasse, whom many of you remember from last fall when he appeared with the Tocqueville program. So that's Mark. Scott Lincicome earned a BA and JD at the University of Virginia. He is now the Vice President of General Economics and the Herbert A. Stiefel Center for Trade Policy Studies at the libertarian Cato Institute. Scott is also a senior visiting lecturer at Duke University Law School, where he taught a course on international trade law, and Duke University, where he taught international trade policy as a visiting lecturer. Prior to joining Cato, Scott spent 2 decades practicing international trade law at White Case, where he litigated national and multilateral trade disputes and advised multinational corporations on how to optimize their transactions and business practices consistent with global trade rules and national regulations. Finally, Scott's regular column, Capitolism, for the Dispatch, is a go-to reading among free market advocates, and you can sign up for his Substack very easily by just going to the Dispatch website. So I encourage you. And then Joseph Brommel, as many of you know who were here last night, is the European director of the Trilateral Commission, a venerable group founded by David Rockefeller in 1973 to promote open dialogue and closer relations between America, Europe, and Asia. Dr. Brommel received his doctorate in political science, sociology, and French cultural studies at the University of Passau. He worked at the German Council on Foreign Relations as managing editor and editor of the International Policy Yearbook and head of the Americas program. Dr. Brommel has written many books, mostly in German, but many of them in English, and his most recent book is co-authored with Matthew Burrows. It's called World to Come, The Return of Trump and the End of the Old Order, and it was published last year. So, please welcome our panelists, and Scott and Mark, come on up. So here's the plan for the session. First, Scott Lincicome and then Mark DiPlacido will take 15 minutes each to briefly outline their positions on globalization. After they finish, I will put a question on the screen that you will work through at your tables. We will then come back together, this time adding Dr. Brommel to our panel, and hear what you learned during your discussion, and then we will repeat the operation until we reach 6:30 or we run out of questions, whichever comes first. So, welcome, Scott Lincicome. You're on first, and just grab, or you can come here. Yeah, if you want. Yeah, that'd be great.
Holding onto the podium prevents my pacing back and forth. It's easier. Well, thank you again for having me. This has been a really fantastic 2 days. And I'm thrilled to talk about globalization, something I've written a lot about, something that is very much in the news. And it's my notes, I actually started with my own definition of globalization, and I actually take issue with your definition in a little bit of a way, because I think too much time is spent, especially in Washington, talking about globalization like a thing. And there it is. It's a process. When in reality, at its root, globalization is just people. It is people doing what they've done since the dawn of recorded history, and I'm actually not exaggerating. Going back to 3000 BC, there is evidence of people engaging in long-distance commerce. It is something innately human. It is something that only people do, and they do it for mutual benefit. Now, globalization is also frequently discussed as just trade in goods. We will hear about steel exports and electric vehicles. But globalization is services, ideas, culture, capital. It is all of these things. And it's happening every day all around us, including right now. Now, certainly, globalization is about policy. We'll talk a lot about that. But it's also about technology, because what connects people? A lot of it is the internet or containerized shipping. All of these things that are simply making it easier for people to do the things they want to do and the things they've been doing, again, going back throughout history. And so people are the driving force behind globalization. We really like it. We love our Squid Game and K-pop and iPhones and all of these cool things. Our grocery store sushi, you name it. And when barriers are put in our way, often by governments, we go right around them like water around rocks in a river. Now, policy does matter, of course, by making it easier or harder for people to do these things. And today I'm going to argue that the default policy for national governments should be one of openness. Now, this does not mean totally unrestricted trade and capital flows, but generally, again, the default should be one of freer trade, freer flows of people, capital, ideas, and the rest. Now, why? Well, I'll start with the easy one, and I, being a libertarian, I have to start here. I think there's a moral case for free trade. For people being allowed to generally transact with whomever they want, whenever they want, however they want, and without people in Washington, D.C. or Brussels or anywhere else telling us what to do. We recoil when we hear about people, the government getting in between us and our doctors, and yet we're not so upset when the government gets between us and a supplier of some good or service. Well, I think we should. I think we have a right to do that, and government has a high burden to get in that way. And I think when people are allowed to do generally what they want and live the way they want, they live happier, fuller, wealthier lives. Poverty is reduced elsewhere as well. These are good things, and I think there's a moral element to letting us live our lives that way. I think there are also geopolitical benefits. Nations that trade together tend not to go to war with each other. Trade produces economic growth. I'll talk about that more in a second. And that can make you more prepared for when disaster or emergency strikes. This is certainly not an ironclad rule, Russia invading Ukraine being a great example. But in general, research shows that when you do business with each other, when you have more trade, you have less war. That's, again, a good thing. But I think the biggest reason is economic, because the economic benefits of trade and globalization are simply massive. Governments allowing people to specialize and exchange goods, services, ideas, and the rest. It's just in similar ways that we live our own lives. We don't make our own food and clothing generally. I grow a garden, but that's for fun. I am allowed to specialize. I'm allowed to do this stuff and then go out to the grocery store and buy. Well, that, again, that's good, that specialization as well. It has great economic benefits. It not only is cheaper stuff, you often hear about cheap t-shirts, but it's more stuff. It's different stuff. It's broader experiences. It's new fields, new ideas. It's more competition, innovation, dynamism. It's a part of kind of the secret sauce of American prosperity is this economic openness, not just for trade and goods, but general economic openness. It also gives us more time. Because we are able to specialize, because we are able to buy the things we want and then specialize in what we do, we just have more free time that can be spent with our families or living in civil society, going to church, doing gardening and ruining the lettuce patch I have because of the stupid freezing. We can do those things. We have that time in large part to globalization. Now, this has real, tangible benefits. A 2017 study said that the overall benefits of globalization to the US economy between 1950 and 2016, this general openness, was more than $2.5 trillion, which is about more than $20,000 per American household because of all of this openness. Our per capita GDP today is 4 times that of China, even when adjusting for purchasing power. This economic growth is linked to better health, better environmental quality, and all sorts of other things as well. And over the long term, the benefits are quite substantial. And to be clear, this is not just benefits for the dreaded 1%. Median blue-collar wages in the United States are up 40%, adjusting for inflation, since the hyper-globalization of the 1990s began. Young male wages, we hear a lot about that when it comes to manufacturing things, are up 10 to 20% as well. The working class, of course, benefits from having access to cheaper stuff at Walmart, food, and the rest as well. The middle class in America, you might hear, is smaller, but that is actually because more households are getting rich, not getting poor. If you look at over time, the share of households making more than $100,000 adjusted for inflation has grown, while the other categories have shrunk. We also have plenty of jobs. Employment continues to go up. Now, certainly most of these are in services today. We are a services economy. A lot of those have nothing to do with globalization, but certainly many do. The iPhone is famously assembled, well, now mainly in India, but used to be China, but that supports jobs in design and marketing and other innovative careers, but also in shipping and transport. It now pays more to move a t-shirt than to make it, and that's generally a good thing. Regardless, it's jobs there as well. But it also supports manufacturing and manufacturing employment. Now, manufacturing employment has gone down over time for lots of reasons, some of them related to trade, others related to automation and other things. But about half of everything we import today are manufacturing inputs, the stuff that our manufacturers use to make other things. So trade, globalization through imports, exports, through IP for people, and other ideas can support manufacturing as well. It's why the United States remains the second largest manufacturing nation on the planet. We are dominant industries in aerospace and satellites, defense, transportation, pharmaceuticals, you name it. And globalization helps there too. The United States also is a tech leader in AI and digital trade and the rest. And this has all happened, all of these benefits, while our dreaded trade deficit has kept on expanding, which maybe should be a hint that it might not be so bad after all. Now, I won't lie to you. I won't pretend that there aren't costs to this stuff. There are some lost jobs. There are disruptions, some insecurities along the way. But first, we have to acknowledge that these are narrow things, that the vast majority of us are benefit, and if we don't work in manufacturing, we benefit entirely, but even if you do, we benefit greatly from this type of economic openness, but not everybody does, and certainly we need to acknowledge that. But we also need to acknowledge that these disruptions are not only about trade, they're about a lot of things. They're, like I said, about automation and technology. The iPhone destroyed jobs in the camera industry, for example. We don't throw our fists up at the iPhone. Interstate trade. South Carolina took a lot of Rust Belt jobs. We never talk about that as well. Too often, globalization is sort of like how Homer Simpson thinks of beer, the cause of and the solution to all of life's problems. The reality is far, far more complicated. State and local policy also matter greatly. While there were these great globalization disruptions, places like Greenville, South Carolina, a textile town, well, they adapted, and Greenville's doing pretty well today. Places like Youngstown, Ohio, didn't adapt as well. That indicates that this is more of a state and local policy issue, not a national or international policy issue. And then we need to acknowledge that some things simply can't be fixed by economic policy. There are cultural issues, educational issues, and people, quite frankly, need to be allowed to make some bad decisions too. And that is just simply part of kind of this messy market economy in which we live. Regardless, though, the costs, like I said, are narrow and they are swamped by all the good things we've already noted, the goods that come from being part of the global economy. The risk of being disrupted by whether it's trade or technology or the rest is the ticket, the admission ticket to a prosperous life and world. And the alternative, stagnation, freezing everything in amber, protecting us from cradle to grave, well, that's a recipe for poverty. We really don't want to live in the 1950s. Quite frankly, I don't even want to live in the 1980s. And we have to acknowledge that generally things are getting better all the time. There are certainly exceptions, national security being the most obvious. We do not want to be buying tanks and fighter jets from the Chinese Communist Party, but those exceptions must be, again, narrow. They must be grounded in skepticism and in reality. We have real issues with China, but we today have tariffs on tiki torches and baby blankets from China. We're imposing tariffs on imports from close allies like Canada and Europe. China also faces huge economic problems of its own that we ignore. We ignore that supply chains and consumers adapt quickly to when trade barriers are put in place. So we need to think of China in terms of what can we fix and what are we doing, and right now policy is way, way too broad. It is a bazooka for what demands a scalpel. National security exceptions can also be routinely abused. Global steel and aluminum tariffs on supposed national security grounds not only have been found to harm U.S. manufacturing overall, so we gain some steel jobs, we lose tons of manufacturing jobs elsewhere, we have lower manufacturing output elsewhere, but they harm strategic industries like shipbuilding and aerospace, things we need for national defense. They also get expanded to steel and aluminum items that have no plausible national security nexus, like rebar from Canada that we use in our construction. National security exceptions also are routinely expanded to cover things that aren't really national security issues. Once the Trump administration, now quite infamously, refused to say to a judge that peanut butter might not be a national security threat. We've heard that garlic is a national security threat. Sugar is a national security threat. When everything is a national security threat, well, then nothing is a national security threat. And we can undermine the very things we're trying to protect. But some might say, what's the harm? Well, I already mentioned some of this, but I'll go through quickly. You know, it's certainly the case that markets are imperfect and market failures exist requiring government intervention. But too often, the alternative, government action, is actually worse. Now, how do we know this? Well, contrary to what we might hear, we have not had decades and decades of unfettered free trade in the United States. We have had years of protectionist policy, steel tariffs, shipbuilding restrictions, buy American rules, sugar quotas, you name it. And we know from the economics literature that those interventions have real costs. Higher prices, lower growth, more politics and lobbying, less freedom, less dynamism and resiliency in our economy. We think of protectionism as making us more resilient. Well, the biggest and deepest supply chain crisis of the pandemic happened in baby formula, where 98% of that baby formula was made in the United States, thanks to trade barriers. Well, one factory in Michigan went down and the whole supply chain collapsed because protectionism had actually made that supply chain very brittle. So those interventions have very serious costs. The interventions often also fail. We've had tariffs on footwear for decades and decades. We've had tariffs on textiles and apparel for decades and decades. We still have empty factories and lost jobs. For industries that have survived, they can become like our shipbuilding industry, very uncompetitive and costly. And those things lead to massive and enduring economic losses and waste, along with the cronyism and corruption. But interventions have another unseen cost. They crowd out better policies, private investments, better government actions. These are unseen opportunity costs, the things not done because we've protected or invested via subsidies and the rest. We also see massive unintended consequences from these actions. I mentioned baby formula already. Another one today is aluminum. We put tariffs on Canadian aluminum of 50% to boost the US aluminum industry. That has not happened. But Canadian aluminum smelters said, well, the heck with this, we're going to sell to Europe instead. Well, now the Iran war has happened, and US is now trying to import from the Middle East because the Canadian supplies we used to get have pushed to Europe because of those tariffs supposedly protecting American industry, a huge unintended consequence of this stuff. Behind much of this is F.A. Hayek, the Nobel laureate's classic knowledge problem. Too often today, yesterday's problems are not tomorrow. It is also very difficult for people in Washington to know how markets will react and adjust. We pick the wrong products, we pick the wrong industries, or in many cases, the market's already moved on by the time a policy is implemented. A few years ago, NVIDIA, the largest and most powerful, arguably most powerful company on the planet, was a little video game company. We had no idea when we were enacting the CHIPS Act that NVIDIA and that AI was the next big thing. And then finally, politics always intervenes in these things, and I mean always, in both the design and duration of these government interventions to slow or stall globalization, to boost domestic industry, you name it, to basically everyone you can look at, you will find loopholes. You will find pork barrel politics. You will find industries that shouldn't be protected that are protected. Trump's tariffs famously last year, he said in April there would be no loopholes and no exceptions. Now there are tons of loopholes and exceptions because a bunch of companies ran to Washington and won them behind closed doors. In this way, some of the things I'm talking about today aren't market fundamentalism at all. You'll hear this term quite often. They're really guided by reality. The reality of how the sausage is made in Washington, D.C. Me personally, a lot of my views on trade come from spending 2 decades dealing in anti-dumping policy with the Commerce Department. These were not wise and unbiased technocrats. These were laws and decisions made by real people with very, very distorted political incentives, not economic ones. And then finally, there's a broader risk from all of this stuff, of a stagnation and sclerosis that will mean lower growth, more poverty, or poorer lifestyles in the long run. If we poison that secret sauce, it won't be the end of the world. We'll just simply be a little poorer, a little slower, and the world will move on without us. I think one of the more interesting aspects of the last year is that no one has jumped off the protectionist cliff that the United States has just jumped off. Governments, the European Union, India, in Southeast Asia, Latin America, they responded to American tariffs by trading more with each other and signing new trade agreements because they still recognize the benefits of this global integration. But quite frankly, you don't really need all of that wonky policy stuff. Just look at a place like Greenville itself, a former textile town ravaged by globalization, moved on, and now is a really impressive city that has multinational manufacturing, BMW, Michelin, and the rest, but also has services as well. And by moving on is healthier, wealthier, and better off in the long run. That was not by trying to save textile jobs. It was by embracing the disruption, finding new and better ways to live our lives and have our jobs. Now look, this is a messy, complex, crazy world of human interaction and of globalization. But it's precisely, I think, the reasons why we should not just defend it, but embrace it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everybody, again for being here tonight. I've got a good amount of material to get through, so hopefully I can keep it to 15 minutes. But I want to start by sort of putting globalization in a historical context. I would say I would probably quibble a little with Dr. Nelson's definition. I think it's a fair assessment, but I think it really requires an understanding of how globalization fits into America and then really international history. And that story is really one that is dominated by 20th century events. So going back through American history, the first bill ever passed by Congress was a Tariff Act. In 1789, first bill signed by George Washington. You can see the average tariff rates throughout American history on the chart. It starts in 1820. You can see that the average U.S. tariff rate on goods that had tariffs really didn't fall below 20% until about 1950. There is enormous historical precedent to U.S. Tariff policy. It was, termed at the time the American system. And the understanding was that the U.S. would really need a strong manufacturing base to be a real global power. Now, the change happened really at the end of World War II. And there were a lot of reasons for that. I could probably spend the entire 15 minutes just on the history of it. But I think some big events to understand and some big context to understand. Coming out of World War II, most of our trade partners' economies, especially our allied economies, were decimated by the war. Europe, Asia, many of the strong economies that we see in the world today were basically bombed into oblivion, right? The U.S. emerged from that war having not really, experienced all of the bombing and the direct combat itself, with 40 to 50% of world GDP and nearly 60% of manufacturing production worldwide. In order to, help its allies catch up, both Europe and in Asia, which was really important in the context of the Cold War, because the Soviet Union was still growing, and there was a lot of concern that economic disruptions from debt after World War II could really have a lot of really negative political implications and potentially allow communism to spread through instability. The United States agreed to lower a lot of its tariff barriers and allow its trade partners to regrow their industrial bases so that the United States wouldn't basically be a debt holder for the rest of the world. Fast forward to 1971, another thing that was done right after the war, right around the end, was to peg the world currencies to the US dollar and then to peg the dollar to gold. The US suspended that gold standard in 1971, and that's, as we'll see later, when you start to see US trade deficits grow and increase. Between that original trade agreement in 1947, which was called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, there were 8 rounds of additional negotiations. The original agreement in the 40s had around 23 signatories. By 1994, when the WTO was formally established, based on the principles set by that original agreement, we're up to 128 countries, so a great portion of the world economy. The major late addition was China, which happened in 2001. And that's where a lot of the history will start for the modern political conversations, because of the challenges the United States faces with competition in China today. So to give you a rough outline, maybe we can get a little more into it in the questions. That's, to me, the very short, condensed version of globalization's unfolding. So there's sort of 3 main reasons, I would say, the people with my viewpoint. There's 3 kind of main arguments that I try to make for why globalization in today's economy, especially versus the 1940s, is not serving American interests the way that it used to, and how it's opened up a number of vulnerabilities in the system. So if you go to the early 90s, when the WTO was being negotiated and there was already stirrings of trying to add China to the World Trade Organization and open up relations there, we had been granting them normal trade relations, meaning our lowest tariff rates since 1980 on an annual basis, but hadn't made it permanent yet. There was an understanding that trade would always be self-correcting. If the United States were to run massive trade imbalances, naturally the system would correct. And that we should really get away from the idea of thinking about needing to worry about competition, right? You fast forward, and this was around the time Hayek was writing as well, was before the gold standard was suspended. So he gets a little more leeway, I think, to have miscalled this one. But Krugman had already seen the 1980s and the trade deficit expanding since the early 70s, and really has far less of an excuse. So this is what happens to the U.S. trade deficit. You can see it's pretty much flat until the 70s. It starts to creep up in the 80s. The U.S. struck a currency agreement with Japan, who was really the main industrial driver at the time, kind of how China is today. And then it really just falls off a cliff in the 90s, and then really especially after China's led into the WTO in 2001. So over time, this accumulates, and how I try to frame it is what essentially a trade deficit means is we as Americans are consuming now about $1 trillion more every year than we're producing. Most people are familiar with the annual budget deficit and how that accumulates into the U.S. national debt. On the trade side, the trade deficit ends up accumulating into our net foreign asset position. So that's what this chart shows. And basically, from the early 2000s, we went from about a $3 trillion deficit on that front to now over $27 trillion, which essentially means that foreign entities now own $27 trillion more in American assets than U.S. entities own of foreign assets. So in a very real sense, we are not getting these goods for free. They may appear cheaper, they may appear to reduce cost, but our government debt and our corporate debt tell a very different story. And U.S. ownership of our own assets and the benefits that come out of asset ownership, right? Appreciation, interest, a better base of wealth to draw from has been eroding steadily underneath our economy. People will say that surplus nations then reinvest that money back into the United States. But as I said, it's more asset transfers than greenfield investment in new production capacity, which is, I think, how most people in layman's terms hear the word investment, right? If you look at just the category that goes to what's called foreign direct investment, over 90% in a typical year, typically less than 5%, goes towards new establishments or expanding industrial capacity. Over 90% goes toward actually just acquisitions, people buying out our corporations from underneath us. If you look at U.S. stock ownership, right, we're down to foreign ownership of U.S. stocks was just above 5% in the early 90s. We're now up to 18%. And if you include broader corporate ownership, we're up to about 40% foreign ownership of our corporations in the United States. There's not a lot of great data kept on real estate, but that's another asset class that foreign entities are buying more of. Intellectual property rights are another. So between bonds, stocks, corporate debt, our wealth as a nation has been slowly eroding. And this has a lot of systemic effects, obviously just from a general loss that otherwise these assets would be accruing to Americans who are producing, earning income, and making the investments themselves. It can also create asset bubbles, and I would say that this trade imbalance that really started to skyrocket in the 90s and then again in the early 2000s helped drive a lot of the asset bubbles that ultimately burst and created the global financial crisis in 2008. The next aspect is, and Scott mentioned this as well, is the national security side of it, right? So Alexander Hamilton, one of our most famous founders at this point, had a report on manufacturers in 1791 that really defined American political economy for over a century. And it actually spread overseas as well, and I think was heavily influential in German economic thinking as well in the 19th century. And he basically said that not only our wealth, but our independence and security as a nation were materially connected to the prosperity of its manufacturers. This was something that people more on the Federalist side and later the Whig and Republican side were always sort of dispositionally their view. The Democrats were more agrarian. They made commodities. They were happy to sell commodities to more industrialized nations like the United Kingdom at the time. And were more sort of free trade even back then. But after the War on 1812, where Britain really came back and challenged American independence a second time, there was even recognition that by Thomas Jefferson, who was initially more free trade, that no, the United States really does need manufacturers, and we're not going to place the special interests of certain segments of the economy over the national well-being. I think on an immediate basis, we saw giant holes in supply chains during COVID especially. I think that woke a lot of people up to the fragility of depending on last-minute margins and global supply chains for essential goods in both parties really and across the spectrum. But I want to make a broader point as well that one of the promises of globalization, and you've even heard it, I think, in the events this week, is we were promised that we would be able to specialize and focus on the highest tech sectors, the most advanced sectors. We don't need to make t-shirts anymore. We don't need to make sneakers anymore. But if you look at the trade balance, we went from a $40 billion surplus in the early 90s to last year a negative $400 billion deficit. And as a share of US exports, advanced technology exports actually decreased and our deficit increased faster than goods as a whole. So we didn't become more competitively advantaged by globalization. We bled our best in our most advanced sectors. And to include Apple iPhones as a foreign product that Americans love, I think is really unfortunate. We do innovate, we develop the high-end tech here. I really think that it would benefit a wider swath of Americans if Apple employed, I don't know, a couple tens of thousands of Americans rather than a couple thousand. And then sort of more broadly and conceptually on the innovation front, the former CEO of Intel, Andy Grove, drove this point home a lot throughout his career that basically innovation happens where production happens. When you're making something, when you're working among suppliers, you discover things on the factory floor. There are ecosystems that develop around production. And when you offshore all of those things, the innovation is going to follow. He uses the example of batteries, right? Which initially the dominant market for in the early 2000s was in consumer electronics. It seemed pretty inconsequential to let what was largely at the time toys gravitate offshores to China. Those batteries then quickly became essential to the laptop industry and now are dominating the EV market, which aren't as popular in the United States, but worldwide are picking up very heavily. So even things that seem inconsequential at a certain time, you never know downstream what's going to happen. So it's not to say we need to make sure we are the world leader in every single sector, but to completely lose a sector or to lose a sector substantially that is still a pillar fundamental to the economy, I think is a major mistake, both for national security and for innovation. The last point I'd make on this is that the industrial base was essential to winning World War II, right? When people think of American greatness, a lot of the imagery, the impression we have of American greatness comes back to that. Comes back to our ability to produce, to innovate, to scale. We sort of rested on our laurels after that and assumed that it would run indefinitely, even if we opened our markets. If we want a strong industrial base or a strong defense industrial base, we really need a broad industrial base to draw from. Because when we're not at war, we can't continually depend on spending more and more on defense to prop up an entire manufacturing sector. You need a mix of both private and public demand for goods that are going to be essential in times of emergency. And then there are a lot of spillover benefits to manufacturing as well. There's a 2.2 job multiplier, and this is a broader concept I want to explain as well. I mean, we obviously have a very strong services sector in the United States, but in order to bring money into your community, you need to produce things. It's not functional for a society. You can't have a society where everybody cuts each other's hair when everybody needs a basket of goods that is much larger than haircuts, right? So if you're entirely sector-based or service sector-based, you're going to naturally put yourself at a disadvantage, and this comes up in our trade balance as well. We do run a services surplus, but our goods deficit is 4 times larger than our services surplus. So we have this digital economy now, we have this financial economy, the services economy that overlays and is often at the forefront in people's minds of US economic strength. But that physical, that base layer, that industrial economy never goes away and remains essential to day-to-day life. The last main argument I'd make is what I would frame as sort of widespread prosperity or economic quality. There's 2 inputs to growth. You can either grow volume or you can grow productivity. And on both segments of that, in the industrial space and manufacturing, we've seen a decline over the last 25 years. Industrial production, if you exclude computers, which are which are calculated in a problematic way that's a little in the weeds. Industrial production has actually fallen over the last 25 years. And even if you include those, it's only grown by 7% between 2000 and 2020, when it doubled between 1980 and 2000. So we really haven't seen increased production in the age of globalization. And secondly, manufacturing has also slowed, which for an advanced economy like the United States to be, still number 2, but really slowing in productivity is a very negative sign. It takes more hours today in the manufacturing sector to produce the same amount of goods than it did 15 years ago. And then manufacturing, as a percentage of jobs, because of automation, because of the transition to service sectors, there are a lot of secular reasons why manufacturing as a percentage of US jobs has declined. But we really didn't see a net decrease in manufacturing jobs until the China shock in 2000. Keep in mind, across all of this time, the US population is increasing, right? So I think the US population increased by about 120% from 1950 to 2020. To see net declines in manufacturing jobs as the economy doubles is really concerning, and it's what caused what's termed the China shock. So you can see that there has not been this wellspring of economic growth. These are the average U.S. growth by decade. There are a lot of factors that go into growth. I'm not trying to oversimplify the story and say globalization is the only reason U.S. growth hasn't gotten above 2.5–3% since the early 2000s. But certainly the people who argue globalization was going to be a wellspring of prosperity for the United States and for growth and for innovation, that does not bear out on the top line numbers. And one of the reasons for this is that we've set up a two-track economy. If you look at income growth, it's been really positive, really great at the top. That dark red line on the left side is the top 5% of U.S. income earners. Their income growth has tripled or quadrupled since 1970. The bottom half of American wages have basically been completely flat. And if you look at the right graph, those top 3 lines that sort of trend up together are GDP per capita. So the broader GDP number, even though it's slowed, we've still had growth. Corporate profits have grown, and even labor productivity has grown. But if you look at average wages for production and non-supervisory employees, they're basically the same as they were in 1965. When it comes to assets then, so those were really focused on income. When it comes back to that asset question that we talked about before, that top line is actually only the 80th to 90th percentile. The top 10% doesn't even fit on the chart because the average increase the cumulative increase in assets owned by the top 10% of income earners in the United States has increased by $29 trillion since 1989, and the bottom 50% has lost wealth. Scott brings up the people love Squid Games. I think it's a bad example because it's a show about people who own a ton of debt and are competing for their livelihoods as a chance to bail themselves out. And the trend towards sort of dystopian fiction in broader society, I think, is a very bad sign. Now, as a conservative, it sounds left-wing to talk about inequality, right? And we're not supposed to approach it. But I think from a political economy perspective, what a Republican form of government really requires is widespread prosperity and a solid middle class. And if a certain segment of the population is really pulling away from the rest, and people don't feel like they have access to that economic security, that's going to create political instability. And if we don't see it with Trump, then we'll see it with Bernie Sanders or AOC on the other side. And I don't think the trend towards populism and anger is going away. And more physically, right, this has resulted in a big surge in deaths of despair. In the mid-2010s, the surge in deaths from drugs and alcohol abuse was enough to actually bring down the overall U.S. life expectancy during peacetime and without a pandemic, which I don't know if it's unprecedented, but it's got to be pretty close, especially in the most advanced economy in the world. It's enough that people with a college degree now in the United States, on average, live 8.5 years longer than people without a college degree. and the rates were similar to the collapse of the Soviet Union in Russia in the 1990s when you're looking at deaths. So I'm going to skip over how great the results have been for China. I think the one graph I'll show is that this is China's share of global manufacturing. It went from, I think, roughly 3% in 1990 to now around 30%. The UN projects it could go up to 45% if nothing changes by 2030. The US share has dropped from 23% to 16 to 17% today and is projected to drop to 11%. China's manufacturing capacity now exceeds the US, Germany, and Japan combined. So they really have benefited much more from the United States, or much more than the United States from globalization. And then quickly, just to show that tariffs are effective, that bottom red line is trade volume with China after tariffs in the first Trump administration. We see a really pronounced drop in imports from China as a result of those tariffs. And then we hear over and over again, especially last year, that tariffs were going to cause higher prices, a big surge in inflation. There's no noticeable increase in inflation from the tariffs in the first administration. Here's the very short-term results from the second Trump administration. That peak at the top after Liberation Day is the lowest rate we've seen since June of 2009 in terms of a monthly trade deficit. So we're seeing some positive early signs. This is our balance with China, which has come down substantially. And then again, looking at tariff inflation, we see a little bump at the late summer, early fall, but it's clearly very much in line, top line CPI. And then core CPI, which is prices minus food and energy, also very, very brief blip, and then back even down under where the trend line was before. I'll skip my two end notes, but thank you very much.
Very much. I'm going to invite Joseph to come on up and fill in the last seat up here, and we'll go through here. Okay, so I'm sure these gentlemen would like to engage one another, but we're going to leave that for a little bit later, and we're going to get you all talking to one another. So here are the discussion questions. First of all, please introduce yourself to each other if you haven't already done that. And then you have little timers on your table. What I want you to, they're 2-minute timers, and I want you to go around and ask yourselves this question. Which take on globalization do you agree with more, and why? So you'll just have 2 minutes to do that. If you want to pass, you can pass. But try to get talking to one another, and then we will come back as a group and do more with these folks. But I want you to do this first. So on your mark, get set, go. Does anybody have questions that they would like to ask our panelists? And we've now added Dr. Brommel to the panel. Anybody out there come up with a question that they really think needs to be addressed? It would be very unusual if you had no questions. McKenna, I'm coming.
Hi, so this may be a little bit of a silly question, but it was just something that I was thinking about in terms of what each of y'all choose to focus on in the different lectures and things like that. So Dr. Bramwell pointed out last night that Trump's kind of movement and what got him elected, there was kind of this myth, or maybe not myth, depending on how you view it, of economic prosperity that he would bring that really fueled the working class to support him. And I'm wondering, with some of the kind of pro-globalization viewpoints, how do you handle then that group of people who still feels really gypped and still feels very angry and confused, and they don't know what kind of to do, because globalization may have helped some communities but not their community, And how do you deal with that other than kind of like throwing the facts at them?
Well, I mean, it's always good to start with the facts. But I think it goes back to something I touched on really briefly, and that is, I wish we had just more recognition that the world is not monocausal, that a lot of things are blamed on globalization and foreigners. And shadowy elites as well. When in reality, it's really complicated. And oftentimes when I talk to audiences that are skeptical of this stuff, I think it's totally fine to acknowledge that there are real costs. Disruption is hard, particularly the 50-year-old manufacturing worker that can't easily shift to a different place, has a mortgage that's underwater, that kind of thing. Those are really hard issues, but they're also not oftentimes a globalization issue, right? It's a state and local policy issue, an education issue, an adjustment issue. The China shock, for all of its focus on China, if you actually read the papers and talk to the authors, they will tell you that's actually an adjustment issue. Economists thought that workers hit by any sort of big seismic disruption, trade, technology, you name it, would adjust. They would move on eventually. They would either move to a different place, they would move to a different job, and they didn't. And that was the novel findings of the China shock were about adjustment. And so I think one of the things I focus on at Cato is adjustment policy. What are the things that actually make it really hard for people of any age in any job, for whatever reason, to move on, to adjust? Is it housing policy or criminal justice policy or labor or tax or trade or whatever, right? And again, that goes back to when you're talking to these audiences, skeptics, right? You talk about, hey, there are a lot of other things that are going on. And oftentimes you're sold a bill of goods by a local politician or a CEO or a union leader because it's easy to say, yeah, it's those guys' fault, not mine, right? But if you look at a place like Greenville, you compare it to a place like Youngstown, you can see that, or Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, another great example of places that do move on. And they do it, and it's oftentimes because of good policy. We were talking last night, Greenville's had really good local policy, right? And that's a huge part of it that globalization discussions just can't get at.
But I would say, just to intervene there, we have good policies, but we also we're open to foreign investment and
change. I mean, there was a great piece a few years ago about Youngstown, and this is why I ended up writing about a piece, one of my columns on Greenville versus Youngstown. So every presidential candidate for the last something like 50 years has gone to Youngstown, Ohio, and promised to bring back the steel industry in Youngstown. And they just, this kind of refusal to not be a steel town, right? And I know that's psychologically difficult, but Greenville did. Greenville was a textile town, and then said, okay, we're done with that, we're moving on. And that's critically important too.
Yeah, but I do know there are some people in this room, even at my table, who really suffered during that time. And so, it comes back to Joseph Schumpeter, who said, economic change is creative destruction. Somebody gets destroyed.
And I think that one of the things that guys like me need to do better is we should be sympathetic towards these things. It's, these disruptions are hard, change is hard. And it's also important to acknowledge those difficulties. But the solution, in my opinion, is not freezing places like Greenville and Amber and hoping for the best. It's moving on, and policy should help with that.
Yeah, we also need traffic control. Okay, anybody else?
Too many people
Anybody
moving
else?
here.
Okay. Oh, okay, Clay, last question. Oh, here it is. Not last question. This.
So, Mr. DiPlacido presented a lot of data and a lot of graphs, and so I was curious to hear, Mr. Lincicome, your thoughts on all that and kind of what all that means for America in relation to the global economy, because I'm sure kind of what that means and what its importance is it probably differs in your viewpoint.
Yeah, a lot. I'll start with a real simple plug. I wrote a long paper on the state of American manufacturing and national security a couple of years ago. There's a ton of data in that paper. Did not want to bore everybody with a ton of data. Not that Mark was boring, but just I wanted to go a little bit of a different way. But first thing I would say is for at least half of the charts that Mark showed, I could show a different chart explaining a different viewpoint of different data or burying into the data. I'll give you one simple example. If you actually look at manufacturing output in the United States and you disaggregate it, right? If you look at what's the manufacturing that went down, what's the manufacturing that went up over the last 20, 40 years, give or take, right? And you adjust for inflation, you do all those important things, you actually see that a lot of the manufacturing output that's gone down are textiles and apparel and footwear and tobacco products and paper products, things that have been dematerialized out of the economy entirely, so things that I just don't care about. And so, and quite frankly, while they have real human cost, if you're worried about industrial output in the defense industrial base, which was what this paper was about, it's not important. So I think generally, without having a battle of data, I would say you have to get under the hood with a lot of this stuff. The same goes for inflation data. If you actually look at core goods inflation over the last year, instead of looking at the overall CPI, which contains tons of stuff that has nothing to do with trade or goods, you actually have seen a rather substantial bump, which most economists think are because of tariffs. Now, does that mean you have inflation over the long term? No, because inflation isn't caused by one-off things like tariffs. But that does mean it raised relative prices of those goods, the tariffs did, right? So again, you have to get under the hood. And so I think that without doing too many things like that, I could parse that all day, but I don't want to bore you with stuff like that.
Mark, do you have a response? Would you like to respond?
Sure. I mean, or you could look at the top line data and see that, like, either whether it's on the inflation and the horror stories that we heard about how bad it was going to be for the economy this year were just not borne out by reality.
Please check my record. I never warned of that. In fact, I said, please don't call it inflation for these very reasons. Just saying.
And that's that's great. Not everybody has that fortitude, and I'm not trying to accuse Scott of anything, but the general sentiment was dire when the tariffs were announced, and J.P. Morgan put their estimate of the likelihood of a recession up to 60%. There were a lot of dire predictions that just weren't borne out last year. But when you look at top line manufacturing output, it is down. You look at productivity growth, it is down. And services, there's a lot of obviously benefits to services, but if you are worried about national security, if you are worried about having wider distribution of jobs for wider distribution of skill sets, interests, capacity, then I think it's important to maintain a strong industrial base.
Okay, we'll make get one more question in here. Just for all three of you, in your ideal world, what 3 policy changes related to globalization would you like to see the American government make? And I'm only giving you 3. And you got to come up with them fast, because then they're going to discuss them at their tables. So anybody want to go first? 3.
First, education. Second, secondary education. And third, tertiary education.
Yeah.
You have to take care of those who need to adapt to a changing world. And believe me, maybe the 3 of us have to think of a different job when AI kicks in and all that. I mean, it used to be blue-collar workers, automated. It wasn't only South Carolina and China taking away jobs from the Midwest. It was automation, and the next thing will hit in. And so you have to adjust, and you can say to both parties, they didn't do, I mean, they put out some legal stuff, but they didn't follow through to re-educate people and this and that. And so I think, this country even more so, my country needs education to match up to the standards of the Chinese. They're ahead of us on all STEM areas. We just don't want to see. We pride ourselves we are number one. We're not. We're getting...
Our butts kicked.
well, you have more experience with teaching than I do.
Okay.
Yeah, so
What do you think?
one, I think we need a substantial reform of U.S. tariff law. Too much power has been given to the executive branch. That whether you like tariffs or you don't, I think hopefully we can agree that a single person shouldn't have a little tariff switch in the Oval Office and be able to affect $3.5 trillion worth of commerce overnight because he doesn't like a Canadian television ad. And that's what U.S. tariff law does, and I think that's a big problem, so I want to see that reformed, simply to create more balance between the legislative branch, which has Article 1, Section 8 power over tariffs and trade policy, and yet has delegated it all to the executive.
You still remember Congress?
Just to have a little more balance between the two, I think, is critically important. Second, I think is actually not trade and goods related at all. It's much more related to immigration. I think we need liberalized high-skill immigration desperately in this country. It's really important to have the smartest minds in the world doing stuff here, including paying taxes, but also innovating. And I think that's critically important. And then third, I'll do a bucket, it's cheating. But I think we need better adjustment policy in the United States. We have this thing called trade adjustment assistance, but why not tech adjustment assistance? Why not just adjustment assistance? And then all of the government policies that I mentioned and more that make it really hard for people to live where they want to live, to work how they want to work and do these things. And I wrote a whole book on this if you're interested, not related to globalization, called Empowering the New American Worker, which is all about this type of stuff, about a dynamic, flexible economy, and a workforce, about people being able to do this. Hitting all of those, that kind of adjustment policy, I think, is critically important because of disruptions like globalization, but not just globalization.
Mark, you're 3. He cheated, but
I did.
yeah.
No, that's all right. I would say the way to structure tariffs is sort of the substantial question that's being meted out right now, right? There's a lot of different authorities that can be used, but I would say, zooming out from the authorities question, to me, ideally, what you really need is a baseline, whether you set it at 10%, 15%, but something that's going to ultimately plug the hole that supply chains are. The way supply chains work in the global economy today, right? So the difference between the first and the second administration's approach to tariffs has been the first really focused on China, right? Which really is the main driver of the problem, but because supply chains are so integrated, China's been able to get its goods into the United States through third countries, whether it's Vietnam, Thailand, or even Mexico. So there has to be sort of a baseline to make sure that leakage doesn't continue to happen. I think second, and along those same lines, having stronger rules of origin to ensure that more of the content that is put into the goods from countries we trade with actually comes from that country and receives the favorable tariff treatment that those goods get. So this would mean, the way trade law currently works a lot of the time is a tariff rate is determined based on where the good undergoes its last substantial transformation. So you could have 90% of the content of a good made in China. There's a minor tweak made to it in Vietnam, and it's only paying the rates that Vietnam would get for its goods, if that makes sense. And the last thing I would say is that China is and continues to be the main driver of these global imbalances. I talked about how the U.S. has about $1 trillion deficit. China's now up to a $1 trillion surplus, and they orchestrate their entire economy to favor production. And I think maintaining what really needs to stick, right, is that China has to have a higher rate than everyone else. And globally, I think there needs to be work with our allies and really pressure to make sure China isn't able to continue to run this excess capacity and undercut its own laborers and dump goods on the rest of the world, because it's at a point now where it's not just disrupting the U.S. economy, it's really starting to disrupt Europe's economy, formerly really strong manufacturing bases. China's turned its attention to the types of goods that are going to really undermine other economies now. So,
Very good, very good. Okay, now, why don't you all at your tables do the same thing? Now, not everybody has to talk, but what of those things sounds good to you, or do you have something else that you think our politicians ought to be doing in Washington? Okay, we're coming up on the end. I want to know, what was the best idea that your table came up with? Maddie, what was the best idea?
I would say higher education and just the continuation of education.
So self-serving. But I like that because no AI is going to take my job away. I'm going to go over here. What was your best idea? Oh man, you got a variety of folks here. Jalen, what's the best idea?
Well, we didn't have much agreement, but over here we tend to go with the more free trade argument. We do believe in more favorable trade conditions for the sake of investment and increasing our economic growth and success.
Yeah, and just looking at you guys, I know there wasn't a lot of agreement on all of that, but that's the whole point of these things. How about you all back there? Mary Christine, what was your best idea?
We were kind of looking at it maybe from the other end, where it's like maybe college is oversaturated, and like, you know, maybe moving in the other direction would actually help us rather than harm us in this situation.
Tech education, or what do you
I mean, but yeah, like more specified.
Not necessarily college, but
Yeah,
something else.
maybe.
Yeah, that's only 1/3 of Americans have a college degree, so you know. I'm going back here. Ethan's table. What was your best?
Once again, education. That's what we talked about. That was just like the best route to go. It's gonna like bring us closest to China. It's gonna really like close that gap. So, I mean, that was the. Oh yeah. We're also a little. I talked about how we were a little like worried about the service industry really like encroaching on like the majority of U.S. jobs, and I think there definitely needs to be something to like complement that on the other end. Like policy-wise, education can't be like the main priority, obviously, but
You're looking at a service industry worker. I mean, and think about the job I've got. I get to hang out with 18 to 22-year-olds looking at this beautiful lake. You're dumping on service industry? Good grief, this is the best. All right, well, we are going to, I promised you, 6:30, and we did not get through all the questions, as I will show you now, but I do have one last thing you have to do, which is that. Your post-event survey. See if you learned anything, or I don't know. I haven't taken this in a while. And while you all are doing that, let's give it up for our 3 great panelists who have helped us out for 2 whole days.